Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Before I lose sight of it, it's just about the last time you can sign up for the Shakespeare retreat at Lochsaw Lodge, the 19th to the 24th of January, or Water in the West, 13th through 18th of January, also at Lochsaw Lodge. These are fantastic. There are just a tiny number of places left. If you're going to join us for these kind of the reading book club that you always wanted to be in, now is the time to do it. Just go to jeffersonhour.com. Water in the West, and then Shakespeare Without Tears, just west of Missoula, Montana, in a kind of a winter wonderland of beautiful temperatures, mulled wine, and great conversations.
Oh, so we're getting the pitches out of the way at the top of this podcast intro.
I didn't regard that as a pitch. I regarded it as an opportunity. But yes, I just wanted to make sure everyone heard that.
This is a pitch, and that is, if you enjoy the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we would appreciate very much you considering supporting the Thomas Jefferson Hour. It's that time of year. If you'd like to help the Thomas Jefferson Hour, simply go to Jefferson Hour.
Boy, do we need help.
In so many ways. Go to jeffersonhour.com. You can support the show. You can join the 1776 Club. The long-promised Jefferson 101 series, I can tell you, is in production.
Really?
Yes, it is, but it's...
the webmaster has put it together.
Well, I've helped a little.
But the bulk of the work went to him.
I'm reaching for a piece of paper. See this?
Yes, I do.
That is the list.
How long is it?
312
hours?
Well, it's not that many. But anyway, we're putting that together for the 1776 Club members in chronological order with all of the extra stuff cut out, and we had hoped to get that done by the end of the year. No promises, but it is in production. So go to jeffersonhour.com. Keep your eyes open for that.
And support us to the extent that you can, but principally by telling everyone you know.
Yeah, mostly thanks for listening, for taking your time to listen to us. Please write us. We love the mail. We love the questions.
We love to hear from our listeners, and I do. And I meet them in my travels, and they invariably ask about the elusive David Swenson. And some people rebuke me for calling you the
but it's a term of endearment, and if you quit, I would be heartbroken.
Well, I tried once, and then you said, please, bring it back.
No, I like that. Yeah.
So, yes, but this week's program is about correspondence between James Madison and his closest friend, someone he deeply admired, Thomas Jefferson, and how the pattern is that Jefferson says something a little bit wild or a little bit radical or a little bit idealistic on steroids. And then Madison comes in and says, what a terrific idea. Love it, sir. But let's kind of work through some of its provisions here, shall we? And talks Jefferson off the ledge.
It's a fascinating bit of correspondence. I'm hoping we can at least get some links up to some of these letters for those of you who would like to delve into it.
The one that I like, we didn't really talk about. The one that breaks my heart is the letter Jefferson wrote to Adams when Adams was
I think
elected.
we should come back to that next year.
You know that story.
Jefferson wrote a letter to Adams when Adams was becoming president, and it was sort of a, let's work together. We've been friends in the past. We don't always agree, but let's work together. And
I heartily congratulate you. Maybe there are ways we can bind this country together.
And the interesting thing about it is that the copy of this letter does not exist, which is unbelievable.
Jefferson kept copies. Well, he sent this one to Madison, and Madison talked him out of it. Here's a little paragraph about it. This is from a book called Madison's Gift, which I very much like, by the way, by David O. Stewart. And Jefferson, this is Stewart. Jefferson toyed with the idea of extending an early olive branch to Adams. He drafted a letter wishing that any Adams administration, quote, may be filled with glory and happiness to yourself and advantage to us. Unsure whether to send the note, he forwarded it to Madison, asking him to send the letter on to Adams if it seemed a good idea. Madison thought it was a terrible idea. And then Jefferson let it go. He never sent what could have been one of the great, could have changed the course of the history of the United States, so that the vice president and the president, when they're from different parties, as they were then sometimes, could actually work together almost as like joint presidents or co-presidents or the loyal opposition with emphasis on loyalty. But Madison said, I wouldn't send that, and Jefferson then didn't.
We do talk about one of his more famous letters, The Earth Belongs to the Living.
One of my very favorite letters. and usufruct. People, you have the right to the fruits of your estate for the term of your life.
So with that, once again, we can't thank listeners enough. You're so kind, and we do appreciate the criticisms, and we love the questions. So before we go to the show, just once more, thank you for listening.
Keep listening. Please tell your friends. I think great things are happening at the Jefferson Hour. Support us if you can. Come to these cultural retreats in Idaho, and then later the retreat for Steinbeck in California. You can find out all about those things. But what I like most about this program is the people who write to say, this matters to me. This is my little window of enlightenment in a sometimes crazy universe. And that pleases me, David, more than anything else in my work. So thank you all, and let us now listen to James Madison attempt to chasten the whimsies of one of the most imaginative men who ever walked on earth, Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, when he's here, is portrayed by the gentleman seated across from me now, the humanities scholar and author, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And I think I need to begin this week's conversation with a bit of an apology, sir.
What might that be?
Well, as you know, it was my turn to get to the barn early and get the heaters going, and I'm afraid I was a bit tardy. I notice, sir, you still have your jacket on.
Well, I don't know what our listeners around the country and around the world know about the state of North Dakota. It is very beautiful. I just drove across North Dakota this last weekend to give a lecture to some landowners up in Stanley, North Dakota, which is north and west of the Missouri River, and it is so beautiful. But as I drove, David, I thought, what would somebody from Mars, or what would somebody from Massachusetts, or what would somebody from California think of this? Because this very, very, very lightly populated, endless prairie, I saw corn stalks, and I saw ducks and so on. I saw ICBM missile sites. We were once an extremely important part of the Strategic Air Command. We have these underground silos. I saw some late harvest of corn, which was pretty late in the game. This is early to mid-December. I saw wind farms. I saw some coal strip mines and coal generation plants. I saw this massive dam, Garrison Dam, which at the time was the largest earth-filled rolled dam in the world, is still, I think, the fifth largest earth dam in the world. And so those are a lot of punctuation marks. And then little villages. And in each of the little villages, I mean, when I talk about a little village, I mean 1,500 people or 900 people or maybe up to 2,000 people. At every one of them, you see a convenience store, often with nobody in it, the kind you just put your credit card in the gas machine. And at each town had a bar on the highway, and at 1 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, every one of those bars had 5, 10, or 15 pickups parked in front of it of farmer citizens or rancher citizens having a little beer or a shot of something and watching the world go by on a Saturday afternoon. The weather was absolutely perfect, but it is not for everyone. It was about 14 degrees Fahrenheit, wind of about 5 to 7 miles per hour. So that's pretty cold. If you had to walk very far, you could die of hypothermia pretty quickly out there. But here's the thing I want to say. Most of it was absolutely empty land. I mean, just a very, very tiny human footprint, and then endless land in every direction. No trees, only trees in the water courses and the shelter belts that have been planted since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. You just fall in love with it. But at this time of the year, I wear a coat more often than not. And if you had only come to the barn this morning, as I think you promised to do,
right? Yes,
and it stoked the fires, and so now here I am in my coat. But it's mostly habit right now.
Well, I do apologize, and things shall warm up during the course of our conversation
I would hope so.
This week. It is interesting to hear you talk about North Dakota. Our three leading industries are energy,
agriculture,
and tourism.
Well, and tourism is a little bit of a fraud. We're the least visited state. That's not likely to change much. And we count as a tourist anybody who happens ever to stay in a hotel or motel in the state of North Dakota. That's not people who are coming here to surf. I can tell you that.
But then we do have a national park that's astounding.
We have an extraordinary national park, Theodore Roosevelt National Park, established in 1947 in the western Badlands of the state. I love North Dakota, as you know. I know you love North Dakota, but it is an acquired taste.
The long-running joke is that North Dakota exports wheat and children.
Our children for marketing somewhere else.
Yep.
If Jefferson could be dropped into North Dakota,
he would leave quickly, probably.
Well, he did tell his daughter Martha once, he was in New England. He said, I could not live in so cold and abysmal
Well, he has told me on
climate.
Multiple occasions that I'm, in his gentlemanly way, that I'm quite insane for picking a place like this to live.
Well, from his point of view, of course, he's absolutely correct. It's not for the faint of heart, this world of North Dakota. But if Jefferson were dropped here, I think here's what he would say. Number one, he would say, it is treeless. That's going to be a problem because a Virginian builds a barn out of trees, builds fences out of trees. Trees are a central building product and fuel source in the forested parts of the United States. The treelessness of the prairies was one of the great impediments to settlement, and sod houses and so on had to substitute for what would have done somewhere else. The second thing he would say, though, is positive. He would say, look at my rectangular survey grid system. Every square mile, every township, these section line roads, it's all laid out in perfect geometry. He would say, but here's what I don't get, North Dakota. You have 3 perfectly rectangular boundaries, and then on the east, you let the Red River of the North be your boundary. It's sinuous and zigzags, and it's not straight. Why would you violate the principles of geometry in so sullen a way when you came deep into the project? You could easily have squared off the eastern end of your state. Why did you choose to share a border with Minnesota, and a border that's not a straight line? I think he would say the third thing he would say is, oh, look at you. You're agriculturalists. I love you. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, he would say. And I gave this talk for the Northwest Landowners Association up in Stanley, North Dakota on the weekend. And I finished this long talk, and it was about the history of extraction and the way North Dakota tries to be survivable, even though we don't have a diversified economy and not a very happy climate. And at the end, I said, I just want to close by quoting my favorite sentence from my favorite person, Thomas Jefferson. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people. And a woman came up afterwards and said, I just burst into tears when I heard that. I've never heard that before, but somebody somewhere understood us.
I'd like to get to the subject of this week's
kind of fun, though, just messing
conversation.
around here.
Yeah, but I have to comment on one thing that you said.
What is that?
About trees.
Treelessness.
I was watching a documentary on PBS last week, and a gentleman whose name escapes me was talking about the landscape around Lubbock, Texas.
Okay.
Which is pretty much identical to...
The Great Plains extend all the way from the center of the Canadian provinces down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Treeless. And he was saying that the land around there was flat and treeless. And he said, in fact, if a tree grows, people will cut it down because they don't want to spoil the view.
I once was with my friend Quentin in Amarillo, up in the panhandle of Texas, which is really the quintessence of the Great Plains. And we went to the first tree. When white settlers came there, post-Civil War, up to the panhandle, somebody planted a cottonwood tree, and then they nurtured it. Everyone protected it. They put fences around it. They took turns making sure it was well watered, and it was the first tree. You know, who can say that in Virginia or California or Washington or Oregon or Maine, or Illinois for that matter? But this was the first tree, and it lived for a long time, 60 or 70 years, and then died. And so then they planted a replacement tree, and you can go and there's a historical marker out on the wild plains of Amarillo that says, "This was our first tree." That's beautiful, I think. Maybe pathetic, but beautiful.
We have had a couple of conversations in the past 2 weeks. I sort of requested that we do this.
You started us down this path.
Actually, a letter from a listener did, but we talked with President Jefferson about James Madison, and at the end of last week's conversation, you brought up some letters that Madison had written, and we thought we would delve into those a bit. Now, this is probably our last sort of regular Jefferson Hour for the year, because next week we're going to talk about Christmas.
Our Christmas show.
And the following week we're going to talk about the year.
New Year's.
Looking
back
Year's,
and looking forward in the principle of Janus, the two-faced Roman god that gave us the name of our first month, January. The reason that we're talking about this is that the theme that has emerged from this conversation about Jefferson and Madison is that Madison gave much of the best energy of his life to protecting Jefferson from Jefferson. That Jefferson was a genuine radical in every sense of the term. He was a political radical at times, but he also was kind of an intellectual radical. And so he would do and say things that Madison found odd and troubling and maybe destabilizing the very idea of the American success in our republic. And so he spent a lot of his life trying to listen carefully to Jefferson's strange radical ideas and then to try to either translate them into something that could actually be successful in the public arena, or to talk Jefferson out of them, or to change the subject so that Jefferson would lose interest and move on to something else. But I think it's fair to say that if there had been no Madison and we had just let Jefferson be Jefferson without this extraordinary second person who loved him, who cared about him, who respected him, who wanted him to succeed, but who thought he was often a little too whimsical, let's put it that way, Jefferson probably would have been a failure. Madison is essential to Jefferson's success as the major political figure of his time, and Madison was able to chasten and discipline and focus Jefferson's amazing energies into something that was more socially compatible with the American Republic that was emerging. That's where that began.
And so that will be the subject of this week's conversation, and we'll start with a letter that Jefferson wrote to Madison in September 1789.
During the French Revolution.
A famous one, that the earth belongs to the living.
Jefferson's out looking around, trying to think about what's going wrong in France, and says, really, the world belongs to the people who are actually living on it, not to those who came before.
Right now, sir, we need to take a short break. When we return, we will return to that letter. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And this week, we're going to discuss some of the correspondence between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison. And I was going to suggest we start with a letter from September 6th, 1789, a quite famous Jefferson letter, The Earth Belongs to the Living.
Jefferson is in the midst of the French Revolution. He asks a whole series of fundamental questions. What is a society? What is a social contract? When do people have a right to have a revolution? If you have a revolution, what happens to the national debt of the preceding regime? Are there laws that carry over, or do laws become extinguished when you return from civilization to a state of nature? What is one generation's duty and obligation to those that came before, and duty and obligation to those that come after? So he's saying this is unusual. So at the moment, for example, the United States has been around for a couple of hundred years. Nobody expects a revolution. There might be some things that happen, but no one expects a fundamental revolution here. But what if there were a revolution, then what? And Jefferson's saying, how do you regroup? What gets grandfathered in? What things can you just kind of jettison because you now have this opportunity to jettison things that just weren't working? So he's thinking about these things. This is what I mean by radical. Yeah. He's thinking about the very essence of civilization, and he writes to his closest friend his new theory of it.
It's interesting to me because what survives from the letter is that famous quote, "The earth belongs to the living." But if you read the letter in its entirety, it's really an argument that Jefferson is making to Madison. I set out on this ground, which I suppose to be self-evident, that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living. Goes on to say, I say that the earth belongs to each of these generations during its course fully and in their own right. On a similar ground, it may be proved that no society can make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. Then he goes on and he sort of deconstructs his argument and lays it out for Madison. It's quite extraordinary.
And he's starting with the problem of the national debt. So his question is, why should your unborn grandchild be saddled with a gazillion-dollar national debt of the United States? Shouldn't they come into the world unencumbered from the mistakes of the past? So who can make the case that there should be a perpetual national debt and the unborn should be required to pay it? And then he thinks, and as long as we're at it, why should there be a perpetual constitution? We broke with Britain. Once we came together and had constitutional conventions, both at the state level and the national level. We wrote new constitutions. We ratified them. They constitute a social compact. We live according to them. Why should the unborn automatically be required to live under those systems which they had no role in crafting or ratifying?
And he picks the period of 19 years as the length of a generation. How did he come up with that?
He's a statistician, David. Jefferson is a statistician. He loves statistics. I took a course in statistics in my first year at university at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, and I absolutely loved it. So Jefferson is saying, okay, well, if I'm right that the earth belongs to the living and not the dead, and one generation has no right to, and so on and so on, what is the length of a generation? How do you determine when one generation has passed away and another one has come to be? And he realizes, it's going to be very difficult because not everyone's born on the same day and not everyone dies on the same day. So you have to actually sort of stick goalposts somewhere, maybe not arbitrarily, but certainly abstractly, and say this generation can be said to have started on such and such a date, and that same generation can be said to have expired on such and such a date. And so he says, how would you do that? How would you do that? And he thinks, all right, I'm going to use statistics. And so the question is, if there are 100 people living on an island today and they create a constitution, when will the majority of them be gone? Because we live by majority rule. So he uses statistics and he says, in about 19 years, 51 or more of the original inhabitants of that island will be dead. Therefore, they have lost their enabling majority. Now we need to create a new constitution so that we can make sure that the earth belongs to the living. And so 19 years he chooses from actuarial tables and statistics. Today, because we live so much longer, we've doubled the lifespan of the first world's people in the last 100 years. Today, he would say maybe it's 37 years, maybe it's 39 years. But the question is, when are more than half of the people living at any given time dead and gone? And that's the moment that you can choose arbitrarily to call the generation. We think of the baby boomers, we think of Generation X, we think of different groups and say this is a generation. We don't really have any precise way of demarcating what one is. We just sort of decide, and Jefferson's trying to make it a little bit more mathematically precise.
And he really lays this argument out in such a beautiful language and sort of say, here, Madison, take this and see what you think. I thought that was great.
So he goes through all of this, and you just see poor Madison, rolling his eyes and shaking his head. But at the end of the letter, Jefferson wants to make sure that Madison doesn't regard this as a mere literary excursion or philosophical essay.
Right.
He says, I'm quoting now, "Turn this subject in your mind, my dear sir, and particularly as to the power of contracting debts, and develop it with that perspicuity and cogent logic which is so peculiarly yours."
That's just great.
So, you're a genius. You do it. Now he says, and I want this applied in the real world. I'm quoting again. "Your station in the councils of our country gives you an opportunity of producing it to public consideration, of forcing it into discussion." All right, so I'm expecting you now to take my great idea and to apply it in the political arena. And then he says, I know, I understand how you're going to respond. I'm quoting again. "At first blush, it may be rallied as a theoretical speculation, but examination will prove it to be solid and salutary. It would furnish matter for a fine preamble to our first law for appropriating the public revenue, and it will exclude at the threshold of our new government the contagious and ruinous errors of this quarter of the globe," meaning Europe, "which have armed despots with means not sanctioned by nature for binding in chains their fellow men." So he's saying, this is not just like a Thursday morning thought experiment here. This matters.
Yeah.
I want you to take it very seriously. I want you to apply it in the real world. And I do not want you to say, this is great theory, but it has nothing to do with anything that matters in the world. It does.
And Madison certainly takes up the challenge. He responds to him.
So Madison receives this letter, and Madison is the guy who was in Philadelphia, who somehow crafted together a consensus constitution in that almost impossible circumstance. And all Madison thinks is, we've got a constitution. Now let's just let it play itself out and build stability and give it some traditional weight and majesty so that we can have an organized society. And then suddenly in his mailbox, Jefferson wants to shake things up every 19 years.
But Madison does it so kindly. It is his letter, this February 4th letter. "My first thoughts lead me to view the doctrine as not in all respects compatible with the course of human affairs. I will endeavor to sketch the grounds of my skepticism," and he does.
Translation: what an idiotic idea.
Oh, I don't know that.
I'm going to have to very gently explain to you that this is impossible, that you've gone off the deep end, that there's no chance that this idea could ever work, but I can't offend you. John Adams would just say, "It's an idiotic notion, my dear Jefferson." But Madison's going to say, "All right, it is a great idea, sir, but there are a few little things perhaps you might wish to think about as we try to apply this in the real world." I love the fact that he says, "My first thoughts lead me to view the doctrine as," quote, "not in all respects compatible with the course of human affairs." How would you translate that?
Well, I don't know that I would say that he was going, "You're an idiot." I think
not an idiot, but
I think you used that word.
I did.
So, yeah.
As a piece of sarcasm. I think his view was, how am I going to talk him down from this ledge?
But he does.
He does. He takes it apart piece by piece.
Mm-hmm.
He says that a society can be divided into three types of laws: the Constitution, laws that are irrevocable, and then laws are just kind of neither here nor there. Then he says, but here's the problem with your plan as I see it. We don't really know when one generation ends and another begins. And besides, I'm using some contemporary terms, but if Generation X builds interstate highways and post offices and canals and bridges and creates a whole system of improvements on the land, doesn't that put the succeeding generation into some obligation? There's a continuity in human affairs, and the works of one generation have implications way beyond their terminus. Let's say that I create a university in Virginia because I think it's the right thing to do, and then I die. Does that mean that those that come after say, well, that was then and this is now, we'll just close the institution?
Well, I go back to an earlier part of the conversation where you were saying that if Jefferson came here, you have such a nice square, and then on this one side, you have this odd. I relate that to him saying, okay, Generation X starts in this year, and at 19 years later, it ends, and not taking into account that things are never that rigid. There are births and deaths, and how do you actually... But he wanted it nice and neat, black and white, and organized, right?
Jefferson says, look at coinage. You can have shillings and pounds and pence and so on, guineas, or you can have a decimal coinage system. Look how much better it is. Look at land. You can have meets and bounds system where the border is that rock or that tree or that mountain ridge, or you can have the cadastral survey grid system where it's all geometric. You can have a generation that never ends and never begins and it's all just a morass, or you can actually use the mathematical science of statistics to determine what a generation must be, and then you can use that to demarcate your society. So Jefferson's always looking for the ironclad, rational, mathematical, geometric solution to all problems on Earth, and he doesn't see why everyone else doesn't look at it in precisely the same way. And Madison's view is that there's way more continuity than discontinuity in human affairs, and you can't split off generations, that the works of one generation have implications into the next, just as a parent sacrifices to educate her or his child, that child has some obligation to that parent. The obligations work in both directions over time, and that it's a little bit irrational, or let's say unreasonable, to impose these extremely mathematical solutions on what are, after all, pretty messy human problems.
He writes, if the earth be the gift of nature to the living, their title can extend to the earth in its natural state only. What does he mean by that?
He means, I hear your argument, but then he goes on to say the improvements made by the dead, let's say building interstate highways or airports or universities, the improvements made by the dead form a debt against the living who take the benefit of them. And so the dead have created a better society. The ones who come after them, their children and grandchildren, don't inherit the world in nature. They inherit the world in culture. And that means that they have actual obligations. Here's an easier one, David. Let's say that France invades the United States, and in order to survive the invasion, we have to borrow $100 billion. So we increase the national debt by $100 billion, and then we win the war. Jefferson's view seems to say our children don't have to pay off that debt. That's not their generation. Madison's saying, wait a minute, they sacrificed to make the country free and sovereign for their children and grandchildren. Don't their children and grandchildren have some debt to help pay off these obligations that came for the improvements of the country? It's not, in other words, it's not just like your parent generation just going out and buying stuff at a Walmart. The previous generations were investing in the larger improvement and development of the country, and that one generation has some obligations to those who laid down the railroad tracks or laid down our university or our public school system.
You know me. I'm trying to always understand the character of these men. I mean, I don't want to think that this letter that Jefferson wrote to Madison is nonsense.
It's not nonsense. It's a great corrective, and that's what Madison is saying. Madison is saying it would really be useful for us to think about this a lot. You're absolutely right. It would really help if we all thought about this and let it help us make decisions. So take now, for example, David. We're racking up national debt through the roof. It's not at all clear that we're in some time of international emergency. Jefferson's saying, really? You're going to, I mean, I'm extrapolating, but he's going to say, really, the people of the early 21st century get to leave their unborn children and grandchildren this whopping, out of control, ruinous national debt that wasn't about building new highways. It was about refusing to pay taxes for the services that you want, and now you're going to require them to pay this off? Or Jefferson is saying, to put it more in terms of where we are, so the Electoral College is designed by the Constitution makers in 1787. Maybe it was useful then. It's not at all useful in the year 2018. In fact, it's an impediment to our progress as a democratic nation. So what? We're going to be stuck with it forever because they did it? We have to bow down to our predecessors? Jefferson wants to tear up the Constitution of the United States every 19 years and start fresh. He wants to tear up the national debt of the United States once per generation and start fresh. And he wants to tear up most laws. They want sunset legislation so that laws expire in such and such a period of time, so that if you want to re-up the Patriot Act, you have to do it explicitly. It doesn't just carry on forever, that we build sunset clauses into all essential legislation. So Madison is saying, these are pretty good things to be thinking about.
Then my takeaway from this letter is Jefferson saying we owe an obligation to future generations. Is that
to clear the world for them?
And he's trying to come up with a practical way to do that.
Yes.
But did he know that it was impractical, or did Madison have to point that out to him?
That's the thing, David. So it's a great question. It's a fabulous question. Does Jefferson, in his heart of hearts, or in the deepest recesses of his great mind, realize that this is really a talking essay rather than something he intends to be applied? You want to say, oh, he's just having fun or he's just wrestling with ideas. But he says to Madison, I want you to apply this in the public square. You're in a unique position to make this the law of the United States. Jefferson believes that this is the right thing to do. And if he were here, he would say, the attendant chaos is a price worth paying for human happiness and inheriting the world in a free state. Of course it's going to be a little disruptive, but you know what? That's better than entailing your great-grandchildren with stuff, constitutional provisions, laws, debts, and madness that nobody should have to inherit.
So it was a challenge to Madison.
It was, and Madison's view was, I think, you weren't at the Constitutional Convention. You're sitting in Paris. You're drinking a glass of Bordeaux. You're looking at this cataclysm, the French Revolution. You're a philosopher. All great things, mind you. But now, sir, let us go to the real world.
That's great. That helps. We need to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to move to the period of the Constitution and some of the correspondence between Jefferson and Madison.
Yes, this is fantastic. Jefferson and his key debt to the sober thinking of James Madison.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson, just sneaking in a little announcement between segments of the Jefferson Hour. I want you to join me this winter at Locksaw Lodge, west of Missoula, for 2 humanities cultural retreats. The first one, Water in the West, January 13th through 18th, and the second, Shakespeare Without Tears, January 19th through 24th. For more information, go to our website, jeffersonhour.com/tours. We'll see you in the mountains. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, today out of character with my friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. We began, my friend, by talking about what is so unusually beautiful about North Dakota, and then we slipped into Mr. Jefferson's key relationship in his life with one James Madison.
Can we go right away to some of the correspondence between Jefferson and Madison during the Constitutional Convention?
Yes, so Jefferson is in Paris. Madison is in Philadelphia. Madison is the father of the Constitution. Jefferson is deeply interested in these questions, but he wasn't there. He doesn't know what it took. He wasn't in that room. He didn't see all the very difficult compromises that were hammered out. He didn't witness the times when the Constitutional Convention nearly broke down. He's looking at it as an abstract document, as a product of a convention, whereas Madison is looking at it as someone who's pretty bruised from that process.
And Madison wrote to Jefferson in December of 1787, kind of just a short update on how things were going and what was happening and the votes. What really struck me is Jefferson's response to Madison's letter. But he starts out the things that he generally likes, and then he goes in to another paragraph. I will now add what I do not like.
So Madison must have braced himself a little bit at that moment. He's just come out of this difficult, exhausting and bruising ordeal of creating a new Constitution. Now his best friend, someone he never does not want to please, has written some bromides about the good things, and now he says, I will now add what I do not like. The omission of a Bill of Rights, perpetual reelectability of our national officers, essentially those two, that there's no Bill of Rights, and that's going to be a problem with me, Jefferson. And secondly, if you don't have term limits, you're going to move towards lifetime appointments in these key national offices. Those are the two things that really concerned him most.
But first and foremost, a Bill of Rights.
A Bill of Rights, and Jefferson gets his way. He alone does not talk Madison into a Bill of Rights, but he is the cheerleader. I always say he's the midwife of the Bill of Rights. Jefferson said that in that very strong letter, said, what every people on earth has a right to expect against its government is a Charter of Rights. It can never be left to inference. It's not implied in this or any other constitution. So Jefferson says, look, if you want this to be accepted, it's already a little too strong for my tastes, too centralized. If you think this thing has any real chance of being accepted by the American people, you must add a Charter of Human Rights. That should have been in there in the first place, but you can still add it.
Another line that really stuck out to me was, after all, and I'm quoting, it is my principle that the will of the majority should always prevail. And he goes on to say, so if it's passed by majority, I will cheerfully embrace it.
Right. So he says, here's what I think. So if you all, I mean, I wasn't there, and this is how it works. If it gets ratified, I'll be with it. We can always amend it later. But he says, what about this for an idea? What if you had a second constitutional convention? And you could use what you've done in the first one and maybe take things a little bit farther. So how about a second round? How would that suit you?
Poor Madison.
And then he also says, well, Madison's not going for that. Poor Madison's like, what? Really? You want us to do it again?
But Madison's always a gentleman.
No, he never just says, come on. So then Jefferson falls to the next plateau and says, what about this? What about this? What if 9 states ratified it and it became the law of the land, but 4 states voted no, so that would be an incentive for a Bill of Rights to be added? What if states endorsed the new Constitution with the proviso, with the condition that a Bill of Rights was going to be added or it wouldn't come into effect? And Madison, again, is thinking, oh boy, really? How about we just ratify and accept, and then we'll think about having a Bill of Rights, which is what happened.
We've just barely touched this subject, and it's fascinating.
So cool.
We may have to come back to it, but there is one more line, if I can quote from Jefferson's letter.
Yes.
Above all things, I hope the education of the common people will be attended to, convinced that on their good sense we may rely with the most security for the preservation of a due degree of liberty. He hangs on to that forever, doesn't he?
Education is the universal fixer for all human problems. I happen to think that Jefferson is 100% right about that. We are not going to have time to go into some of these others, David, but
maybe another time.
One of them is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where Jefferson introduces the concept of nullification, and Madison says, wait a minute, maybe not that far. And then Jefferson writes a treatise saying that states like Virginia should plan to secede if things don't go their way.
And that's okay.
And Madison says maybe not far.
Yeah.
And late in life, Jefferson writes one more saying that it's all becoming national, and there's infrastructure, and there's a national debt, and it's all kind of gone exactly the way I most feared. Maybe it's time just to Virginia to become its own Commonwealth, or the South. And Madison says, maybe not so far, my dear friend. And then, of course, one last, this is the saddest one for me, the letter of congratulations that Jefferson wrote to John Adams when Adams was elected president. And he sent it to Madison first, saying, what do you think? Should I send it? And Madison said, I don't think I'd send that. I think that might be kind of a straitjacket you're putting yourself into.
We may have to come back to this in the coming year.
But think of what it says, that Jefferson trusted Madison to talk him down. And in every case that this happened, Jefferson yielded to Madison's stronger concern. So he trusted him. He needed him, and he trusted him. And secondly, Madison, with exquisite grace and generosity and respect, pulled Jefferson down to earth and made Jefferson a greater man than he otherwise would have been. It's a fabulous story.
Great conversation. I thank you, sir, as always.
My friend, thank you.
And as you know, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Every era faces its own set of issues, and every president attempts to address the challenges and opportunities of American life and to reset the country to the extent that it is possible. It was easier to influence what Jefferson called the course of human events back then because we were just beginning. Decisions made then were going to percolate down through the decades and centuries. For example, George Washington decided he wanted a cabinet, so he simply created one, even though the Constitution is silent about how the executive organizes his administration. Washington had just 4 cabinet officers. Today's presidents have 15, but the administrative structure is the same. Jefferson chose to send his annual messages to Congress by courier and not go up in person. That tradition endured until the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Today, though the Constitution is once again silent, a president would be roundly condemned if he emailed his annual message to Congress. His annual January appearance before a joint session of Congress feels constitutional, but it is just a piece of invented political theater. My point is that today most traditions are set, baked in, as the pundits said during the election of 2016. A modern president can whittle around the edges, but America is more or less what it is now. Once in a while, a modern president tries to eliminate a federal program, the Department of Education, for example, or something as puny as the National Endowment for the Arts, and almost invariably winds up failing to succeed. Let's look for a moment at the array of challenges our presidents have faced. The 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, wanted to hold the Union together no matter what. That was his sole fundamental purpose, as outlined in his famous letter to Horace Greeley. Lincoln's agenda was made the more difficult when 7 states left the Union even before he was inaugurated in 1861. He did somehow manage to knit the Union back together, but it took the blood of more than 800,000 Americans to do so, and the fault lines are still visible 153 years later. And that work cost Abraham Lincoln his life. The 11th president, James K. Polk, wanted to annex much of Mexico and expand the United States in the Pacific Northwest. He did just that in a single term. He was the president most closely tied to what we call manifest destiny, the metaphysical notion that God wanted North America to be owned and operated by Anglo-Europeans rather than brown people of any sort, including American Indians. Apparently, we needed Lebensraum. I won't try to make sense of Theodore Roosevelt's plans for America, because it would be like his endless first annual message to Congress, 20,000 words long. Suffice it to say that TR wanted America to take its rightful place in the world's arena, and it did, including his pet Panama Canal. And he wanted the national government to be big enough to address all the domestic issues of American life, chiefly the growing disparity between the rich and the rest of us. That was his square deal. Roosevelt was an unapologetic Hamiltonian. FDR, the 32nd president, faced 2 existential challenges, the Great Depression and World War II. We don't really know what kind of president he would have been or what he would have advocated had he presided over a prosperous America that was at peace with the world. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, thus breaking another American political norm that was not then enshrined in the Constitution. That's how serious the crisis of the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s was. John F. Kennedy was afraid we might lose the Cold War, so he was prepared to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty, as he put it. That seems a little quaint today, when the current president seems to view Russia as a well-run autocracy with which we can do real estate deals. George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president, sought a way of winning and winding down the Cold War without touching off chaos and civil wars in all the newly detached satellite nations, and without doing a victory dance that would harden the damaged hearts of the Soviet leadership at one of the most critical moments in modern history. Plus, he wanted to make sure that the former Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal was properly secured, in the right hands, as the empire collapsed. The current president, the 45th, has determined to reset America's place in the world: NATO, NAFTA, international environmental protocols, the China trade, with a sole eye to maximizing America's advantage and repudiating the philosophy of the Marshall Plan, that is, when America helps the rest of the world prosper and maintain order and due process, we wind up being the primary beneficiary. And he's attempting this fundamental reset using some of the most unorthodox and at times shocking methods of any president in our history. I could continue to try to make sense of the challenge agenda of each president, but I want to turn my attention briefly to Thomas Jefferson. He called his election in 1800 the Second American Revolution. Jefferson was not one to throw words around, so he must have meant something important by that phrase. Jefferson faced two challenges as the third president. Remember, he was far upstream of us in terms of American habits and traditions and expectations. He was up near the source of the River of America, up near the Three Forks, while we are downstream from New Orleans in a deep, broad, incredibly powerful river that often feels more like a sewer than a purling mountain stream. Jefferson wanted to reset the size and scope of the national government until it represented the minimum quantity of federal public authority that could protect us from foreign invasion, settle disputes between states, coordinate our international commerce, and hold 17 states together as one confederated nation, at least with respect to foreign affairs. Jefferson wanted to pare down the national debt as severely as possible, get rid of it altogether, if possible. And that's it. Feeble though it was, he felt that the U.S. government of the first two presidencies, George Washington and John Adams, was already too big, intrusive, and self-aggrandizing, and it needed to be whittled down immediately before it was too late. Jefferson rightly understood that it would soon be too late, and when we look at America in the second decade of the 21st century, we realize how woefully too late it is now. America, with its hundreds of military bases around the world, its gargantuan national debt, its leviathanic regulatory system, its willingness not just to do those things that a national government must do, but tens of thousands of things that are merely desirable. Not long ago, the National Endowment for the Humanities spent nearly $1 million to promote romance novels, including a $616,000 documentary, Love Between the Covers. We spent $1.9 million for lifestyle coaching for Senate staff and $1.5 billion for the maintenance of vacant federal buildings. $75 million in Hurricane Sandy relief went to tourism ads, etc., etc., not to mention National Step-Parent Day, National Cat Day, National Eat Brussels Sprouts Day, and National Handwriting Day. If you doubt me, look them up. When I see a giant electronic sign along a rural interstate saying drive safely or click it or ticket, I ask myself what it cost and who paid for it. The cost would be easy enough to ascertain. Who paid for it? Assuredly not a state or local government. That's federal largesse. Ask yourself this: would the state of Wyoming ever have spent its limited public resources on that sign? Jefferson understood that permitting the national government to swell meant that it could also suffocate, that it wasn't just about government waste and frivolity, it was about whether we can maintain our liberty in the shadow of a large and ever-growing national government. In other words, for Jefferson, it wasn't about NAFTA or trade with France. It was about whether we can remain a republic dedicated to the maximum freedom of every individual American. Jefferson's basic view of any government program would be, we can probably do without it. If you rigorously ask yourself that question of every U.S. government program, you would answer as Jefferson more often than not. Jefferson's second agenda was to keep America safe and sovereign in the face of the Napoleonic Wars. This proved to be much more difficult because he had no leverage to control the behavior of either France or Britain, as they were locked in a world war for national survival. Jefferson did the best he could under extremely trying circumstances, and since he ruled out the usual tool of such struggles, war, he had a very difficult final 3 years of his presidency. James Madison couldn't figure it out either, and eventually we had to go to war with Britain, the Second War of National Independence. Jefferson left office on March 4, 1809, exhausted and somewhat disillusioned. He had done his best to reset America along Jeffersonian Republican lines, but during those final months, as he assumed more and more executive power to enforce his pet economic embargo program, his peaceful alternative to unthinkable war, Jefferson must have realized that Benjamin Franklin was wiser than we thought when, at the end of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, asked by a woman what they had created behind closed doors, he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." We didn't. Alas. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.